This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me again after a very long hiatus, it's Tony Black. Hi Tony, how are you?
I'm great, Duncan. It's really nice to be back on Primitive Culture. It has been some time.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Well, I think I was on the live sort of episodes we did, the ones we did at DST and things like that. But, they're slightly different from us sitting down on our recording software and hashing through a topic. I think that's been getting on for a year. So it's nice. I feel like I've come home.
Hopefully we're going to keep tempting you back. You're going to be the Denise Crosby of Primitive Culture, I think. Which means you come back to save the day this time, and then, after that, you're going to be in villainous mode.
Yeah.
Causing trouble.
Through an alternate universe. Standard. Standard, yeah.
Well, the reason Tony's back with us this time is he got in touch with me and said there was a topic that he was itching to discuss. And rather than me try to kind of lay out what that topic is, I think maybe the best thing is if I hand over to you, Tony, and you can talk the listeners and me to some extent through what we're going to be talking about today. Because I have to say, I mean, normally with Primitive Culture, I've sort of commented on this on Twitter, I go a bit overboard on the research. I usually have pages and pages and pages of notes. This was something you just got in touch and you said, Duncan, I want to talk about this particular topic. Can I come on and do it? And I said, yeah, sure. Okay. So we're going to kind of fly by the seat of our pants a bit, but hopefully we'll have fun. It should be an interesting discussion. So over to you, Tony.
Well, I mean, this is, it's one of several episodes really that hopefully you and I will get to do when I can pop on to Trek FM every now and then. And it's one I've been really interested in for a long time. I wanted to come on and look at our future, where we are today, and Star Trek's what would be considered Star Trek's future history, as it were. Because over the course of all the Star Trek series, going back as far as the 60s, the mythology and the continuity of the whole Star Trek universe has explored aspects of how we got, as, in Enterprise says, from there to here. We know the circumstances that the Federation and Starfleet were formed, in the mid-22nd century. But what about the steps that took us from our modern sort of nation-based globalized world that we live in now, founded on capitalist principles? And, the history of Star Trek isn't much different from the history of our world today. And how do we get from this through to this unified world government by the late 21st, 22nd century, who abandoned, even the use of money and invested in humanity's sort of scientific and humanistic progression, as it were, instead of the the drive for avarice and for personal gain and things like that. So what I wanted to explore with this was how near or far we are to that future, to the future we love seeing, and that is one of the greatest things about Star Trek. I mean, what do you think, Duncan? I mean, how far away do you think we are right now from the United Federation of Planets?
Right now, with Brexit looming, I mean, as we're recording in like a couple of months' time, it feels like it's quite a way off, I have to say. I mean, there have been times, certainly in my lifetime, where it felt more like we were heading in the right direction. I don't know whether I'd say we are now. I mean, I always, it's an interesting topic, this. It does interest me, this idea of this kind of, the gap, I suppose, between the time that Star Trek is created in, the time that we're consuming it initially, and obviously the future depicted in it. And I guess it's not actually that often that we get to see all that much of it on screen. I mean, typically we get kind of, it's in snatches of dialogue or whatever that this kind of history is built up. I suppose like the Third World War, you've got an encounter at Farpoint. You've got those soldiers from that period. You've got Q and his courtroom from a certain period in kind of, I guess, what we would call the history of the future. You know, what is Star Trek's history, but is our future. And then I suppose later on you get, you know, with Star Trek First Contact, with Past Tense, I guess would be a good example. Past Tense, probably the kind of strongest example of when Star Trek actually goes back into that kind of gap period, that kind of period that's somehow supposed to explain the bridge. But at the same time, whenever we do go back to see that bridge, it tends to be the sort of darker moments. It's actually, I mean, you know, you say, are we heading in the right direction? Well, maybe we are, insofar as we're heading towards, we're heading in a pretty bad direction. And according to Star Trek, we have to go, you know, we have to hit rock bottom before we kind of pick ourselves up and, start sort of, you know, heading for the stars again. So, you know, maybe in that sense we are, but it's a kind of interesting question. It's an interesting question for me. I mean, I write history books, so I'm used to talking about, our history and the kind of real history. I find this kind of slightly murky area in Star Trek's history between, you know, 1966 or as we go forward, you know, 2019 and I don't know, I guess whenever the first episode of, well, maybe when First Contact, I guess that's, what's that? That's coming pretty soon, right? First Contact with the Vulcans is coming in, what is it, 2050 something?
I think it might be. Yeah. I don't know.
You know, in our lifetime, hopefully. But, you know, I don't know. Then there's all, as I say, Eugenics Wars, World War III. And there's this whole sort of confusing thing, which I have never really bothered to try and wrap my head around about, you know, like people went a bit nuts when Voyager went back in time to the 90s and they were like, hang on, I thought the Eugenics Wars were happening in Star Trek's 1990s. And clearly somehow actually, when Voyager went back, they went back into our 1990s. And I don't know, I've never been all that fussed about that kind of continuity. I don't know why, just because to me it seems a bit like a sort of big murky, the Dark Ages. It's kind of Star Trek's Dark Ages. But, you know, I don't know. It's an interesting subject. And over those, you know, 50 odd years, it's true that we have been kind of building into that period and getting glimpses and getting bits of information. And even as recently as, you know, the episode of Discovery that dropped a week or so ago, New Eden, a story that is basically set from within Star Trek's World War III. You know, that's the kind of genesis of that story. So it's interesting that it's a well that they kind of continue to go back to. And I suppose as we get more Trek, as we get, you know, more and more Star Trek content, it's something that perhaps is going to continue to fascinate the writers. And the difficulty, I suppose, is as the time shrinks, you know, if we've had 50 years of Star Trek, once we get, you know, if Star Trek lasts for 100 years, if it lasts for 150 years, do you know what I mean? At what point have we really caught up, with ourselves? And it does increasingly become like these are two different universes, you know, one universe that you and I grew up in, with the internet and so on. And then the other, you know, Star Trek universe with the kind of imagined technology of that kind of period. So it's an interesting question. And obviously it's something that any science fiction show, if it's going to have longevity, is going to have to deal with because, you know, predicting the future is a pretty, tricky prospect, you know, even with the best of intentions and the best of information. On the other hand, in many respects, Star Trek's done pretty well. I mean, we might come on later to talk about technology. And in terms of technologies, I think Star Trek's done a great job of predicting a lot of future developments and, of course, inspiring them. So there's that weird thing of, you know, it's the kind of Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Is it just kind of, are these predictions or is the making of the prediction kind of a way of making it come true one way or another?
We will come on to technology, definitely. I mean, it is, there's a lot in there. You know, you've summarised really well some of the stuff we're going to talk about because it is quite a broad topic. And I kind of think, well, you know, the big crux point of this future history is, as you said, World War III. Now, when this was first, you know, sort of suggested, you know, it kind of sort of was there, you know, in the original series. I think an Encounter at Farpoint kind of, you know, introduced the idea of what was called the post-atomic horror, you know, which is a terrifying, you know, phrase, but this was coming at the end of the Cold War. And I think this is something that's important to bear in mind that, you know, in the 1960s when Star Trek was created, that was pretty much in the thick of the Cold War era. Star Trek was 3 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest point of nuclear Armageddon that we ever faced. And it comes in the wake of that with this optimistic view of the future. But then, Roddenberry is throwing in these ideas. And, in the original series, it was the character of Colonel Philip Green, who was, and we'll talk more about him.
The head of like Marks and Spencer's or something like that?
Do you know he is actually?
Evil dictator,
Well, he definitely saw that coming.
That was like one step on his ladder to world domination.
It wouldn't surprise me one bit. Colonel Green was a good example of that kind of genocidal character. There's talk about how he's responsible for the loss of 37 million lives. This is what comes out in, when he sort of appears in that classic sort of Star Trek alien form in the episode Bread and Circuses. And then you get a little bit more detail, oddly enough, in A Mirror Darkly Part 2 in Enterprise, and then in the episode Demons.
Is it Bread and Circuses or The Savage Curtain?
I think it might be both. I think he's mentioned in Bread and Circuses, and then I think it might be The Savage Curtain where he's actually seen. That's right, actually, you're right. I think that there's mention in Bread and Circuses about an idea of a despot, an idea that World War III sort of, again, had a sort of like a Hitler kind of figure, a sort of a person to sort of angle this genocide around. And I suppose it's that idea that really World War III, in a weird kind of way, in the 60s would have been a fairly simplistic idea of what is likely to happen, in the Cold War era. But by the time you get to the 80s, and Encountering Farpoint is 1987, you've got much more of a description of, I suppose you've got more of a detailed sort of visual of the post-atomic horror, because it was less likely to be a reality by that point. This was the era of glasnost and perestroika and all these things, and then Gorbachev and at the end of the Cold War, the Reagan era. So it was a different world when Encountering Farpoint referenced back to World War III and put a little bit more flesh on the bones. But I suppose it's Star Trek suggesting that in order to reach this future, we've got to go through another and probably an even bigger sort of global cataclysm, a near extinction, I suppose, in much grander terms than the fact that World War II brought us to the brink of the collapse of what we consider to be our society, and then pushed us forward into a different era and a different age.
And there is obviously the sense that, Star Trek, is a product of the 1960s, so it is a Cold War show. At the same time, it is also, I suppose, the idea of the Federation, it is very much like people say it's the United Nations in space. There is that sort of idea of all the countries coming together, everyone coming together, the kind of representation that you see in the original series of this idea of a united Earth. And it's even, before they start talking about the Federation, they start talking about the United Earth Space Probe Agency. Isn't that what it's called? I think?
Yeah, it might be.
So there is that kind of emphasis on the idea of the world coming together, just in the same way as, to a certain extent, the world did come together after World War II. And some of the legacies of World War II have been kind of, exactly the kind of things that we're in the process of dismantling at the moment. These kind of close relationships between different countries and different powers, and trying to sort of work together and, be one, not necessarily one block, but kind of cooperation between different people, which is really what the Federation represents at its best, I suppose. So I guess there is that sort of idea that in some sense, the kind of fallout of World War II is quite, is a sort of key moment for Star Trek. And in this kind of fictional sense, the fallout of World War III has to kind of play that role in the kind of imagined future, because, there's got to be something in the future that kind of makes that leap. I suppose it's a mixture of different things though as well, isn't it? Because it's the fallout from World War III, but then it's also the arrival of the Vulcans. So, we get that in First Contact, all this discussion about how encountering an alien race changes people's perspective. It's a sort of almost a global epiphany that happens. It happens overnight exactly, but there is that kind of idea. They say, don't they, within 50 years, all these things, money and whatever, war and all these things are kind of out the way, that somehow it's this kind of pivotal, almost sort of evolutionary moment that the human race, steps up a notch. The human race kind of matures through the process of encountering, alien beings. And I don't know, that's, obviously something that well, I mean, you're the expert on the X-Files. As far as we know, has not happened so far. But but that's quite a Star Trek view. The idea that aliens come, and aliens coming is going to be the thing that makes us all realise that we're better than we thought we were, and we can work together, and we can be less selfish, and we can, do away with kind of effectively, do away with the kind of capitalism, extreme capitalism that we have today. Where the richest, 25, something like that, richest people in the world have the same amount of money as the rest put
Everybody
together
else.
or something. I mean, I suppose that would be nice if that's what happens if the aliens come. That's quite a kind of uniquely optimistic Star Trek view that that's what would happen. I suspect in reality it could be a bit more of a fraught process, dealing with something as kind of world changing and kind of potentially a potential, especially for kind of global religions. Not to say that their religions wouldn't necessarily survive something like that, but they would definitely, that would, create a lot of problems in a lot of people's kind of belief systems and understandings about themselves and the universe and so on. And whether that would be entirely beneficial, I mean, hopefully it would in the long run, but I suspect it's going to be a bit tougher than Star Trek predicts in that instance.
But this is what really, this is why I think, the 21st century of Star Trek is a fascinating period that I do hope gets explored, either whether it's, in tie-in novels, which is less likely, or that they find a way to do something, in this era, because I think there are massive changes that take place from, like you say, the world we live in now, past the point of first contact, which is actually 2063. So the timeline roughly goes like this. World War III begins in only 7 years from where we are now, which is quite scary. 2026.
Okay, that's something to look forward to.
I know. And it rages for nearly 30 years. So it's a long, long war. It finishes in 2053 or thereabouts. And so that is an extremely long period of warfare, and when you consider that, World War II was only 6 years, World War I was 4 years, and the damage, that was wrought with those wars, this is extremely long period of conflict. So you've got a whole big chunk of the middle 21st century, which is this conflict. And then the fallout from this, where, millions and maybe even several billion have been destroyed. You've got this society that, we see in First Contact, when the Enterprise crew go back, and you've got Zefram Cochrane and Lily and all these, and it feels, if not necessarily agrarian as such, it is very sort of patched together and basic. It does feel like almost a post-apocalyptic society in a way. It has the technology still, that is still there. Zefram Cochrane's working on the warp drive, obviously, which is one of the biggest steps humanity ever takes, but it's in balance with this, this post-atomic world. And you've got, there's a massive contradictions, when you look into it. In Encountering Farpoint, there is a mention of how in the year 2079, there was a culture, it's not named which culture, but there was a culture that descended into near barbarism during what was described as the post-atomic horror. This is running alongside the Vulcans. The Klingons arriving first would have been different.
That would have been interesting, yeah.
Very different.
And, we've got to hope that we're lucky and it's the Vulcans.
And it's the Vulcans.
In, however many years' time.
Fingers crossed. But the Vulcans arriving, like you say, it would have been this massive, theological, ontological, societal shock to the system that you've had thousands of years of multiple religions that have also, many suggested we are the center of the universe and God is, and then aliens come down. That in itself is a massive, massive thing to change the psyche of human beings. And it, and relatively, you feel like that would be a process that could, in theory, take centuries, as opposed to the fact that by the time we've reached 2061 or whatever, we've got the Federation and we've got Starfleet. And it seems that a massive amount of acceptance and human, progress in terms of dealing with things like alien life, in terms of overcoming the fact that, New Eden just the other week was talking about how nuclear bombs were dropped on Indiana in 2053. So you've got an American landscape that has been ravaged by nuclear weapons. You've got an atmosphere which is polluted from nuclear radiation. Philip Green, not the M&S boss, the colonel, was described that he was killing people affected with radiation sickness and what he called impurities, and that is based a lot on nuclear fallout. So, how do you get from that society, that post-apocalyptic society in balance with technology, in balance with this massive revelation of alien life to Starfleet, in a matter of 40, 50 years. It seems, and I think it was in Enterprise, I think it might have been the pilot, where you see a recording from Zefram Cochrane, which is something like the 2130s, before he disappears, and then he reappears in TOS, doesn't he? And he's been gone for years. But so again, you've reached, that's not that far into the future. So, I suppose the big thing to think about is, in terms of our future development, now, I don't know if it would be such a quick turnaround to get from this point to that point.
On the other hand, my instinct is to say it seems very quick, but I suppose you could say there have been moments in history where things have progressed faster than you might expect. And certainly, within the last, if you look at, say, technological change in the last 50 or 100 years compared to the 50 or 100 years before that, certain kinds of changes do seem to happen more quickly than you might expect. And I suppose technological change maybe is, you could say, it potentially happens faster than political change because it can be kind of global in nature. Just in terms of, like, if you think of the ways that the world has changed since we were growing up in the 90s watching Star Trek, and, and as I say, 90s Star Trek making predictions about the future, and, they do, like, in past tense, they do sort of basically have a kind of idea about the internet and so on, but it's all slightly sketchy. And in Future's End, they kind of got this guy who seems to be a bit like a sort of Bill Gates character or whatever. And in the 90s, obviously they're riding that wave of that kind of technological innovation and so on. But, since then, the world has been transformed over and over and over again. And some of it is kind of in a very Star Trek style, something like, I have an Amazon Echo in my kitchen that is basically like the Star Trek computer. I talk to it and it, if I'm lucky, does what I want it to do.
Does it sound like Major Barrett?
It doesn't, sadly. No, that would be a good upgrade. I'd definitely be keen for that.
Yeah.
But it does do some of the kind of things that you want something like that to do. And obviously, you've got Siri on your phone, and you've got all these different virtual assistants and so on. Once they all become kind of integrated, and your house genuinely becomes this kind of thing in the Internet of Things,
smart
we will
house.
basically have that element of exactly, a smart house. We will kind of have that sort of Star Trek future in that one kind of element of daily life. But that is quite astonishing to me. To me, I looked at that and I thought that was the distant future. That was kind of unimaginable. And then a couple of decades later, that's my sort of daily life. Whether something like the kind of societal change that enables the countries of the world to all come together and work together would happen that quickly, I don't know. But you could say that something like, who knows, maybe the Klingons coming would actually make it more likely to happen. Maybe if the Klingons turned up, everyone would suddenly get their, proverbial together and sort it out and kind of work together and think, okay, what the hell are we going to do? And that would bring people together. A shared, a kind of a common foe, as, Captain Dathon was well aware, is a good way of bringing people together, and we sort of saw that to a large extent in World War II. Maybe if there was a kind of hostile, I'm not wishing this on us because I don't fancy our chances, but it's kind of hostile aliens turn up, and that would be one way of potentially bringing the world together quite quickly. I don't know what the impact would be of the Vulcans turning up. If the Vulcans turned up now, it would be a bit of a nightmare. Who do they, okay, so they went and chatted to Zefram Cochrane. What happened after that? Who did he, in that kind of post-apocalyptic world, who did he take them to see next? Do you know what I mean? Was there a president? I guess there probably was a president of the United States at that point. Did they go and meet with him? Do you know what I mean? How did they, whoever, the Eastern Coalition, who they were fighting in the Third World War, how did they get brought on board? What was that process like? Because, it seems like that's still pretty raw. First Contact is post that war, I think, right? That war has finished, and yet Lily assumes that Picard is an enemy fighter. Do you know what I mean? Because he says, I'm not a member of the Eastern Coalition, doesn't he? So there's the kind of assumption that even though the war is kind of notionally over, it might be still, sparking off here and there. So who knows how, what that process is like to bring the whole world together and to be... Because, if aliens come, it's not really fair for one country to kind of monopolise communication with them, is it? There's got to be a way of them... They've got to want to try to, if they say, okay, who speaks for this planet? well, a lot of different people are going to put their hands up.
Well, and this is what's interesting. You mentioned the Eastern Coalition. It's a really interesting thing that exists because, the fact that this is, one of the things about World War III in Star Trek is it almost feels like it's a mythical event. It feels like lost history in a way, even though in your Starfleet databanks, they would have the full broken down, history of every single thing that happened. But to the viewer, it is like a mythical conflict. You don't quite know who it was fought between. You don't quite know who won. You don't quite know what happened to the nation states. You don't quite know where they were when it started and where they were when it ended. And you get this mention of the Eastern Coalition, which has been described by Brannon Braga as originally in the script it was mentioned being referred to as China. And then it was changed because of, fears that it might be a bit politically incorrect and, offensive and that kind of thing. But in the minds of the writers, the Eastern Coalition, as opposed to this vague sort of, Axis power, alternate Eastern, group, which presumably involves China, Russia, maybe Middle Eastern states, things like that, was particularly China. And that's the point where it would have been interesting had that stayed in the script, whether it was for First Contact or elsewhere, that it was a direct mention of the emerging superpower, particularly in the 90s and noughties, that people were particularly afraid of. In this day and age, I think Russia has kind of reasserted itself as the enemy again in American minds, for various different reasons. But, before, the recent rise of Trumpism and that kind of thing, you would have had China be considered to be the big capitalist villain on the horizon, the new Russia. And they were courted as such throughout the late 21st century. There was a classic Nixon, trip to China and all this kind of thing. So they were feared for a long time, and obviously still being a relatively communist state and this kind of thing. So having them as a very, pointed enemy in the Third World War suggests that it was the United States and maybe the Britain, allies versus the East. And, in basic, but that's a very basic way of sort of describing a conflict that wouldn't be that simple, whether it was in terms of how it was actually put across and would lead to the near obliteration of humanity, if nuclear weapons are being used. But what's really interesting is that it's described, actually, the Third World War as being started over the issue of genetic manipulation and human genome enhancement, which is fascinating and it resulted in that 600 million human beings died, which is, I don't know what the percentage of the population that would be, but I'd say it's probably getting on for, well, maybe about 10% of humanity, were killed. And most of the major cities were destroyed, few governments left. And, they didn't go to war over, one country helping another, or they didn't go to war because someone was assassinated, or they didn't go to war because of like a Hitler trying to invade territory. They went to war through genetics, through human manipulation. And that is fascinating because it suggests that the reasons for World War III, apart from being connected potentially to the Eugenics Wars and things like that in the Star Trek history, but it was connected to human biological advancement and manipulation of genomes, which is a big Star Trek fear. And
it's weird to sort of imagine a war being fought over that. I've always been a bit sketchy about the Eugenics Wars as well. Except that I get that. Well, my interpretation, without having really looked into this or certainly having read the novels or anything, is that the Eugenics War, I took it to be, people like Khan that were created. It's when we call it a war, it's more like a sort of Frankenstein's monster, kind of out of control. We've created these people and they've turned against us, or like Skynet in Terminator or something. It's kind of like we've done this meddling and it comes back to bite us on the bum kind of thing. But I'm not quite clear. So you're saying that World War III in Star Trek is also about eugenics, but is different from the Eugenics Wars, or is there an overlap there? Or
it's not clear, and I think
maybe we don't know.
We don't know, and I think there's never been, the Eugenics Wars were never something that was particularly explained. You get the closest that anyone's ever come is the Greg Cox tie-in novels, which are really good. They're a really good read. They're not necessarily canon, but they're an excellent read. And what Greg Cox does is that because in our modern history and necessarily in the history of Star Trek, and this could explain Future's End in Voyager actually, that the Eugenics Wars was essentially a covert secret war being waged between eugenicists, being waged between terrorist groups, and that it was like an underground war. And it was referred to as the Eugenics Wars because it was different people with wealth, with various different agendas, battling each other on actual battlegrounds. There's the scenes, I think, if I remember rightly, in that novel about Khan when he's younger and he's a prince, fighting like with other genetically enhanced people on like the streets of Belgrade and things like that. So I think it sort of overlaps some of the 90s sort of conflicts, like the genocides in Kosovo and things like that, with this idea of a secret war, and it could well be that the Third World War is an offshoot of that, or is a development of that. By that point, it's potentially that either the United States or those powers, or the Eastern Coalition, as they became, were experimenting with genetics, that they'd found some of this technology, some of this research, and they were trying to potentially create super soldiers, potentially create, weapons to defend themselves, weapons of war. And maybe that was what tipped everyone over. Maybe that was trying to prevent a master race, if we go back to more of a eugenic parallel, actually being literalized through technology, through developing technology, biological technology. Maybe that was enough to tip the nation states into a war that destroyed the status quo, that by the time we got to the first contact. And this is the thing, I don't know if there was a president there. It's very unclear, but my suspicion is that the United States may not even exist by that point. It might just be a collection of groups, without a unified sort of whole. And that's something that we never quite learn. But it is very nebulous, but it potentially ties into some of the ideas about, maybe intentionally, maybe not, that certain, writers, certain philosophers are putting forward about how over the next century, one of the big efforts in governments, researchers, corporations is going to be attempting to overcome death, or is going to be attempting to extend the human lifespan. Writers like Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote Sapiens, Homo Deus, fascinating books which talk about our past and our future as human beings. He's talking about predictions about, and a lot of philosophers are talking about how we will potentially be biologically or cybernetically upgrading ourselves as we go into the next century to try and stave off death or to try and prolong life. Maybe certain governments, certain groups were attempting to do such a thing, and they went too far, and they created something that, a bit like the atom bomb, I guess. It's like something, a game changer, that maybe certain governments went, we can't do this. You can't do this. And it tipped everyone over the edge. And it's that in a weird way, Duncan, I kind of feel like, if not this simplistically, something like that could actually be a trigger for a global conflict.
Maybe. I mean, who knows? I find it hard to predict what, I'm not sure I'm qualified to predict a cause of World War III, but I suppose it's possible. I mean, I'm not sure I want to. I suppose it's possible. It does. Science fiction, I suppose, requires you to think a bit outside the box, doesn't it? And it requires you to although Star Trek is steeped in history, and it does often replay a lot of real world history and kind of takes a lot of inspiration from history, it is ultimately science fiction, and it is ultimately an imagined future. And I suppose, who's to say whether that could or couldn't happen, or what the kind of mechanism would be through which that happened, or, how that would kind of spill over into war, or what a nuclear war would look like. I mean, I think throughout the Cold War, people had a kind of sense of what a nuclear war would look like, because they were, almost living with it day by day, anticipating it, duck and cover and all this kind of thing. They were kind of, they were primed for it to happen at any moment. We, fortunately, have grown up in a generation where we haven't really had that. I mean, I suppose there's a possibility of, a dirty bomb going off or something like that. But, we're not really, even with a bit of a loose cannon in the White House and Putin in Russia and everything, which maybe makes it seem a little bit, things seem a little bit less stable than they did before. Even in that situation, it doesn't seem very likely that we're kind of imminently going to be plunged into that kind of situation. But I mean, who knows what might end up changing, and what to me, I suppose it seems more like it would be to do with the kind of balance of power shifting in different places, and more countries acquiring nuclear weapons and that kind of thing, which obviously is something that for many years we've been trying to sort of put the brakes on, rather than a kind of technological development. But I suppose the question is, at what point if someone makes a technological breakthrough which is sufficiently dangerous, in the same way as the development of the atom bomb itself was, hugely dangerous, that someone else might consider nuking it to try and take that away from them, then you do have a kind of, a situation where you could kind of spark off a conflict like that. Whether that's the way it would ever go, obviously, I guess we hope not. But it's interesting the point you made as well. Yes, so you've got the Eastern Coalition on one side. We know that America is obviously involved on the other because, we're in Montana, and like you say, they would explicitly talk about bombs raining down on Indiana. Yeah, I suppose the likelihood is we'd be involved in this one too. Unless we somehow manage to sit it out. Who knows? Maybe, and I mean, maybe this is why, there's obviously a lot of upheaval in Europe as well, so Picard grows up with an English accent despite living in France. Well, who knows what other kind of chaos is wrought by this. And I mean, in the sense that you say that America may cease to exist, maybe the nation states of the world have all basically collapsed by the time the Vulcans arrive, and we've kind of regressed into this, much more sort of a primitive culture. We have really regressed to a much more primitive state. If that's the case, then it becomes even harder to kind of work out. So how do they get from there to Enterprise? I guess they've got some help, slightly reluctant help from the Vulcans. I mean, I don't know what, because there's also this sort of question, we see over and over again in Star Trek, the Prime Directive, and is this a warp-capable species, and what level of, are they sophisticated enough to cope with the idea of first contact and so on. And we understand as well that the sort of concept of first contact protocols have been incorporated by Starfleet from the Vulcans. The Vulcans are the ones kind of in Enterprise saying, well, these are sort of the rules and we don't mess with a culture in this situation. And you get quite a strong sense that the development of those ideas that Starfleet takes on board have sort of come from previous Vulcan ideas about how to deal with alien races and so on. But at the same time, there's this weird sense, if what you say is true and Earth is in this complete chaos after World War III and hasn't really picked itself up very much, which you're right, is sort of what we're seeing in Star Trek First Contact, in that it doesn't seem like they've completely picked themselves up. They're developing this advanced technology, but at the same time, they're living in this weird sort of shanty town or whatever. Then there's this weird kind of question, because Earth in Star Trek First Contact, or at least Montana in Star Trek First Contact, which is all we see of it, is in a much more primitive state than the planet in the TNG episode First Contact, which is dealing with this kind of, how do we cope with the, which is a pre-warp civilization, and therefore, they're not really supposed to know that there are aliens out there, and how are they going to cope with that? And obviously it's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting counterpoint, because in that instance, it's all about, this will create panic. People won't know what to do. This will be awful. If they find out there are aliens, what on earth's going to happen? It's going to be chaotic and disastrous. In Star Trek First Contact, we're going to find out there are aliens, and we're all going to come together and kind of realize, yeah, we had wars with each other and that was stupid, and, let's put all that behind us and kind of embrace the future. Which obviously, we're Star Trek fans. That's what we want. That's what anyone would want to happen, but that's also what we're kind of invested in, because that's the future we want to get to. But at the same time, it's interesting that to me, it feels like that outcome is not guaranteed from that scenario. Do you know what I mean? And it doesn't take, as we see in Enterprise, Zephyr Cochrane, pulling out his shotgun and shooting the Vulcan guy or whatever, for things to go in a very different direction. That I mean, over and over again, Star Trek tells us how precarious First Contact is, how wrong it can go, how, if it's not handled properly, it can lead to catastrophe, war, potentially societal disaster as well. Maybe that Vulcan guy handled it really well, and he was there, listening along to Ooby Dooby and kind of trying to get involved and make a good impression, and obviously he did a good job of it. But at the same time, we know by the time of Enterprise the relationship with the Vulcans has become quite tense, but it could have been an awful lot worse. It could have been a much more problematic situation. And how much is humanity's kind of coming together actually? I mean, in Enterprise we see the Vulcans are being quite sort of meddlesome in some ways. They're quite they're more, or at least they're very kind of strict about what they will and won't do, which I guess fair enough is what the Federation and Starfleet, would subsequently do with other planets and so on. But at the same time, there's a kind of, you sort of wonder, this whole thing of coming together and everything and embracing peace and being much more enlightened, is that partly coming because it was the Vulcans, and because the Vulcans have actually put themselves in this role of kind of almost sort of guardians of humanity, that they're not just going to turn up and say, yeah, you've created warp drive, that's great, okay, keep going, get in touch in 100 years or whatever. They're actually kind of sticking around, and they're kind of getting involved, and they're they almost seem to be sort of shepherding human beings, but in this kind of parental role, because in those early episodes of Enterprise, there's this resentment, we want to go faster. We've broken this thing. We've worked this thing out, kind of like let go of the reins, basically. Stop kind of holding us back. So there is that kind of weird thing that the Vulcans have sort of become these sort of benign, not exactly occupiers, but these kind of benign observers who are there and sort of, okay, maybe they're not meddling too much, but they're sort of, they're not totally hands off, if you know what I mean. They're obviously there and they're having some kind of influence. And whether that is one of the key things that really brings, humanity to the humanity of Starfleet is more in line with Vulcan ideals than the humanity of, the present day.
I think there could be a lot to that, because if you think about, how level-headed Starfleet is and a lot of the principles, you mentioned the Prime Directive, things like that. I mean, I'm not convinced if, Donald Trump's Space Force ever happened and we and we started to explore the universe. I don't necessarily think that when you look at nations' armies right now, when you look at a lot of the navies and things like that, I don't necessarily think everyone is operating with a level-headedness and necessarily a strict code like they should be, especially given governments have agendas, and there are different, things at play in terms of, the targets being chosen, friendly fire, all this kind of thing. I don't know if the Starfleet principles of exploration would be as easy to come by if they were purely based on human ideas, humans completely in charge. I think Vulcans definitely, and their logic and their control in the wake of something like World War III, where humanity have nearly brought themselves to extinction, and the Vulcans come in and say, look, you've invented this technology that means you're intelligent enough to explore the universe. You've mastered the speed of light. However, you guys are still in a mess. You don't have a centralized system. You don't have governments. You don't have people and it would have made sense for them over the next, half a century or more to actually help them put those systems in place. I suppose a little bit like, and this isn't always a good thing, don't get me wrong, but a little bit like an America going into a post-Iraq war, the Middle East, and trying to prop up governments and prop up democracy in these areas. And quite often that leads to more problems. But in theory, the effort is a noble one. The effort is to try and actually help these people, reach some level of democratic civilization where people have freedoms and rights and things like that,
or even like UN peacekeepers, election monitors. I suppose that's what the Vulcan role sort of reminds me of, is exactly those kind of roles where we go in a kind of benign way to a more, in inverted commas, more primitive country, a country that is struggling with these kind of things that we like to believe that we've sort of moved beyond in our own countries, and that we go in and we sort of supervise a little bit and keep an eye on things and kind of, and there is this sort of question there with how involved do you get? Does it go as far as, what they talked about in the Iraq War, regime change, where you actually, are going to get rid of one leader and bring in another and so on? You're going to be quite heavy, sort of heavy-handed meddling in that sense. Or is it a more, like I say, the kind of peacekeepers role or something like that, where it's sort of, you're sort of there, but you're kind of half in the shadows somehow, trying not to take over, but at the same time be there, and certainly for the Vulcans, it does seem like they're being there in this sort of mentoring role, where it's very much the assumption is we know a lot more than you guys, we're the experts, we're here to help. At the same time, the reason they're frustrating is that they're not as helpful as maybe they should be. And, there's this sort of question mark, could they be doing more? And are they actually impeding progress by, maybe they're insisting that humans do things the way the Vulcans would have done them. I mean, the Vulcan development of, from warp 1 to warp 2 to whatever and so on was probably extremely methodical and logical and, took a long time and was done very carefully and, dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and so on. Maybe the human way of doing it would have been a bit more ramshackle and a bit more kind of stop-starty, and a few things might have blown up along the way. But at the same time, we might have got there quicker. And I suppose that's the sense you get in Enterprise, is the Vulcans are saying, no, you've got to, do everything by the book. And, this happens first and then this thing. And, you're not ready to do that thing yet. And it is very much like that kind of, sort of the parent or the teacher. I suppose it's sort of the teacher saying you've got to do things properly, and the maverick student with the brilliant ideas who kind of wants to go off and reinvent the wheel, and kind of create their own future. And I suppose that's definitely there, I think, in that relationship, is that idea of like how much is, and it's important, of course, for Star Trek that the humans are pushing back against the Vulcans, because we don't really want to have the idea that the key thing that happened, and obviously you could say Enterprise is in a sense a sequel to Star Trek First Contact, because the fact that it's the Vulcans in Star Trek First Contact is one of my favourite things about that film, is that reveal. And they don't, until that Vulcan guy steps out of the ship, I don't think it's ever been mentioned that the aliens who are going to play this role are the Vulcans. Do you know what I mean? That is a real, and we sort of think of it as obvious. Yes, it's First Contact with the Vulcans, but the way that the film played it, and certainly, going to see that film in the cinema, I had no idea it was going to be the Vulcans. And they keep talking about, meeting an alien race. And I don't know why, when I was watching it the first time, which was a long time ago, I wasn't really thinking, I was probably too focused on the Borg and everything. I wasn't really thinking, okay, who are the aliens? Who are these aliens? It didn't really seem like a big deal or a big question. And then it turns out the Vulcans, and you're like, okay, that makes perfect sense. And that's a great reveal and a great kind of, a real moment for Star Trek. But at the same time, we do want to feel that, that's not the end of the journey. That's kind of the start. That's kind of the starting point of Star Trek history, in a sense, as opposed to Star Trek prehistory. And it's kind of important, I think, that, we don't abandon 21st century capitalism because these, very calm and measured and reasonable and slightly annoying people come along and tell us, now you really should get rid of money because, we don't have that on Vulcan and we're doing much better without it. That somehow that comes from us. It comes from within. It's not just a set of rules handed down. Almost like like the Ten Commandments, like a kind of, or like the, all these ideas about aliens interfering with human development. You go to 2001 or something like that, and the monoliths. This kind of idea of something that comes from outside Earth, coming and tweaking things a bit, or telling us what to do, or kind of pushing us in a certain direction. I think it's quite important for Star Trek that we feel that Starfleet and the Federation and all of that comes out of something that is intrinsic to us. And certainly you see that in Enterprise with the kind of birth of it's the coalition at that point, not the Federation, but, that it's the humans that are the driving force behind that. And the Vulcans are there and are involved, but actually, the Vulcans are in the middle of this dispute with the Andorians at that point, and it's the humans who are the ones kind of pushing for this alliance and this kind of what ultimately is the thing that kind of brings us into the kind of the rest of the Star Trek future.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting, talking about Enterprise, is that the very sort of the last, what a lot of people I think would try and imagine were the last two episodes of Enterprise, Demons and Terra Prime, which obviously introduces this idea of a xenophobic movement in the 22nd century.
Because clearly that would never happen, would it?
Indeed. Well, this is one of the things that they, apart from the fact they go back to Colonel Green and use his idea of purity as a credo, very much painting Green as a Hitler, very much painting him as a eugenic, obsessive, willing to commit genocide to, wash away the impurities of humanity. But one of the things they say is that one of the aspects of the xenophobia is that they blame the Vulcans for not stopping the war with their superior technology. So only getting involved once humanity's past this and they've shown they can reach the stars. But what they're advocating in that sense is a god coming down and saving everybody, And so it adds an extra sort of religious aspect to the Vulcans without necessarily going down that road, because Star Trek doesn't always overtly go down that road. But it is this idea that they're angry at an alien race for not stopping something that humanity itself has created. And, it's another prime directive, like you say, it's the suggestion is that the Vulcans hadn't noticed Earth before the warp test, but who knows? Certainly other alien races had visited Earth in the past.
T'Pol's, grandmother or whoever she was, who was
right. Well, yeah,
knocking around in the 1950s, wasn't she? But
right,
yeah,
exactly.
I agree. That's the story in First Contact, is that it's kind of not on the radar. It's like totally irrelevant, this planet, until they see that warp, whatever it is,
warp test.
They see that kind of warp test and that catches their attention.
But that seems unlikely, doesn't it? That they wouldn't have any idea. Earth isn't very far from Vulcan, so if they're travelling around the galaxy, you know, it seems odd that they wouldn't necessarily have noticed Earth at least and done some cursory scouting and noticed that this planet was in trouble. You know, these primitives are going to war on each other with vast, powerful weapons.
But maybe it's like, you know, they've probably got 300 other planets in that kind of stage of, you know, sort of post-industrial, atomic or post-atomic kind of development that they're maybe vaguely keeping an eye on. And, you know, they come back 50 years later and, oh, whoops, half of them have blown themselves up. And, you know, who knows what's going on there. And they're kind of, but that's their rule, is like, we don't get involved. We're just not, you know, maybe it's true. They're just not interested. So that's not to say that they don't know that something's happening down there, but they certainly don't see any responsibility for dealing with it. Unlike, interestingly, I mean, we mentioned New Eden. I mean, at this stage when we're recording, you know, we're only a few episodes into Discovery's second season. We don't really know what's going on, but, you know, this Red Angel appears to have stepped in and exactly, you know, and the whole episode takes place in a church, and there is this sense of kind of divine intervention, this kind of alien, godlike alien that steps in and saves a bunch of people and, you know, takes them to the promised land in the Beta Quadrant, wherever it is. And there is this kind of sense, you know, yes, if the Terra Prime people are saying, well, the Vulcans should have, you know, done more to stop that. That is kind of what the Red Angel seems to be doing in that storyline. And obviously we'll have to wait and see how that kind of works itself out. But I suppose there is an interesting kind of question there. And I suppose it's interesting as well in terms of the sort of xenophobic movement. I mean, you know, I joked about watching Enterprise how many years ago. We thought maybe something like that would never happen, and now it has. And I do find watching those episodes today, there is a really eerie kind of, that the guy Paxton does have an absolute kind of Farage quality about him. I think there is something about that kind of populist leader, which is so kind of skin crawlingly, you know, loathsome, quite apart from how obviously evil and deranged he is. That there is that kind of weird parallel there. But of course, in the real world, you know, the racism and xenophobia and so on, certainly in Britain, is directed towards people who are, you know, who are immigrants, who are kind of lower status, who are poor, who are kind of, you know, there's this idea, they're taking our jobs or whatever. But then it's very different from the situation with the Vulcans, where they're advanced, they're technologically superior. There's this kind of, you know, there's this kind of idea for the Terra Prime people of, you know, we're the kind of downtrodden Terrans, in a sense. We're the kind of, you know, the fact that these aliens are all more advanced and more technological, we don't really trust them. We don't really, you know, that sort of plays into it. Well, I suppose you could say that, you know, even with something like UKIP and Brexit and so on, there is this sort of sense of seeing ourselves as England in this very sort of old-fashioned and traditional and sort of nostalgic way. I mean, nostalgia is a big part of that. And of course, also, you know, we started off talking about World War II and the influence of World War II, this obsession with World War II and, you know, we won World War II and, you know, this kind of, you know, that was the day when Britain was Britain and, you know, and these kind of ideas about going back to this past that, you know, in many ways never really existed in the first place. And that sort of, if we could have only stopped the clock of history, if we could have only stopped things from changing, somehow life would be better. Of course, it wouldn't, you know, I mean, in many, many ways, life has improved immeasurably in the, whatever it is, 70 or 80 years since World War II. But that's the kind of fantasy, is somehow that was our moment. That's when I suppose that's when we meant something in the world. That is when we sort of, you know, like to think we saved the world. And to some extent, you know, there's a degree of truth in that, though. In fact, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. But it's that kind of, that idea of going back to this kind of moment where we, you know, we meant something and we feel that we've lost that somehow. We've lost that kind of identity. We've become this sort of less significant kind of, less pure, all of these kind of ideas. You know, we don't have our empire anymore. We don't have any of this stuff anymore. But at the same time, it's kind of, it is this sort of weird fantasy. And I suppose it is interesting that Star Trek does a sort of version of it, and it does have all the sort of xenophobia and so on. And it does, and I suppose it is that sort of same thing that, you know, from our perspective, watching a science fiction program, it's weird. The first time I saw those episodes, I thought it was weird because I was like, this does not feel like Star Trek. This doesn't feel like, I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean this doesn't feel like Star Trek, but this didn't feel like a Star Trek villain. I watched that guy, Paxton, And I thought I could see him in Babylon 5. I could see him in a different kind of show.
Yes, yeah.
I've never seen anyone like this, I don't think, in Star Trek. This is not what Star Trek villains look like. This is like the kind of bastard who screws up the real world. This is not a kind of sci-fi fictional villain. But actually, I liked him for that. I think, he was a really interesting, compelling and kind of believable character, I think, in many ways. Partly because he seemed because he seemed to come from our world, not from Star Trek's world.
Definitely, and I think it's one of those things where Terra Prime was maybe a little bit prophetic and looking over the next hill, because what you described with UKIP, Brexit, Farage is exactly the same thing that's happening in America with the Make America Great Again. This nostalgia for a mythical past that never existed, for this greatness, and importantly, this idea of a culture being eroded, or or the advance of multiculturalism taking away the essence of what we are. And the great irony is, particularly with America, is that it's a nation built on immigration. And that's been something that's been there. Prejudices, going back as far as how when the Irish arrived in the 19th century, and the long battle, in order to go from the Irish arriving on the shores of America to the first Catholic president in Kennedy, and this whole sort of journey of the immigrant. And now it's something that people are fighting back against.
Before that, America is a nation is founded out of immigration in the first place.
Precisely.
They're not making America great again to when the 500 nations were all in charge, are they?
No.
Do you know what I mean?
It's this imagined...
completely ignores that element of history.
Well, exactly. And it's this imagined idea of this pure, American race, like is happening in England with the nationalist agenda about this pure British race, and it's the whole thing in Terra Prime is this going back to this pure human race, interestingly, there was a less in the episode TNG Up the Long Ladder. There's indications of a less aggressive form of something trying to recapture what. Sort of the world that existed before in something called neo-transcendentalism, which is happens in the early 22nd century. And it's this group led by a charismatic leader who decide they want to go back to more of a traditional way of living, to almost like a return to a simpler life. The founder, a character called Liam Deegan, says. In response to the carnage of the war, it's this desperate yearning to return to a simpler form of humanity, maybe one without space travel, without aliens, without this possibility of a future that is scary. And I think that the big parallel with what we're going through right now, and why I think Star Trek's future history, particularly right now, is interesting. You did an episode recently on past tense, which is quite terrifying to watch now because it's it feels incredibly like we're slipping towards that kind of world. It's really quite scary. Particularly right now, looking at this future history is interesting because I think when you look at this yearning to return to a world that may never have existed, it always feels it's a pushback against true advancement. We're in lots of ways. You're absolutely right when you say the world is better than it used to be. We've grown up with luxuries and with freedoms and with, the rights to do things and with emerging technology that our parents and especially our grandparents would never had. They, and beyond that, they had it even worse. There were so many more people who were poor, so many more people who were dying young, so many more people who couldn't eat food, who were starving, Even as, we're talking 75 years ago or whatever, people were being murdered and butchered in the millions. It's easy to think that we have, the world was better in the past. But the reality is, it is on the whole for many people, it is good. Things have improved and we're edging towards a world where there's a lot more equality. There are a lot more human rights. And it almost feels like a lot of these movements and a lot of these things that were reflected in some of the Star Trek future and where that headed is this pushback against that there are a lot of people right now in the human race who really are wanting to get to this kind of Star Trek future, if not Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets, at least get into a future where we don't think necessarily in terms of nations, nationalism, states. We think in terms of humans, a humanistic approach. And it feels like there's almost a an ideological war between these two sides happening. And whether we end up with a World War III, let's hope not, but it almost feels like whether that's exactly what happened in Star Trek, probably it may not have been exactly the same, but you do wonder if there might have been some of that push-pull in that sort of in that sort of possible imagined future.
I guess that, the world has changed, even in the last few years. I mean, if you think about things like elections, the way that elections are won and fought. I mean, talking about Brexit, we had that drama on recently, with Benedict Cumberbatch looking at the ways that campaign was fought. That was I think a real, watershed just for a watershed for a political campaign in terms of the kind of strategies used, the kind of relationship, between truth and facts, and what a reinvention of what in the 90s was referred to as spin, and this idea that you could kind of use PR and you could kind of spin things a certain way, so there's the truth, but you could kind of put a certain interpretation on it, to the idea that you could basically just lie and just say things that aren't true, and if you say it often enough or loud enough or whatever, you'll kind of get away with it. And obviously we saw the same thing, we've seen the same thing with Trump and all this stuff about fake news and alternative facts, and this whole idea that kind of truth has become, it's like we're living in this sort of postmodern world somehow where truth no longer exists, and therefore, who knows, history no longer exists either. And, it is dangerous. I mean, there was a study last week saying that, what was it? Something like 1 in 20 people in the UK don't believe the Holocaust happened.
Yeah.
Terrifying, historical, blindness of that kind of nature, which is, genuinely scary. And the way that technology actually plays a part in that, because of the way that information can be disseminated, to the individuals, which I guess was the thing in the Brexit campaign, this idea that you tailor your messages to specific people, and you're hitting them with Facebook ads that no one else, well, not no one else, but that person is seeing the particular ad designed to kind of, get them to think something. And this kind of, the idea that, oh, no one wants to hear from experts anymore. Everyone's opinion is equally valid. Every version of history is equally valid. All these kind of things, they have, you were saying something more optimistic. I don't want to sound too negative, but they have changed. They are game changers, I think, these things. And they will, going forward, I mean, we'll sort of have to wait and see, what is the next not that I'm assuming we're going to get one on Brexit, but, what is the next big issue that's debated going to look like? What are the next few elections going to look like? How are we going to come back from this? Because in a way, it sort of seems like it's kind of a one-way trajectory. And what impact is that going to have? And what impact is that going to have in terms of how much trust people have in their leaders? Are there sort of basic ideas about the kind of trust in institutions that are going to break down? Are we going to, because potentially there's a real crisis. And I think that often where we have had these rather dubious results, and I'm thinking, for example, the whole question in America about what was Russia's role in the election, and what was, we've had these, we had the same thing with the Brexit referendum. Was it legitimate? We know they overspent, therefore that, the election spending was illegal. Does that mean that the election itself is illegal? What does it mean if there are just blatant lies involved in persuading people of things that were never genuine intentions in the first place, and certainly never possible? But it feels like from the institutions, there's this real kind of desire to say, okay, that was the democratic result. It has to be respected. We're going to respect this, whether we agree with it or not, whether we think there's something dubious going on or not. We had the police saying they're going to decline to actually investigate some of these things because they think they're too politically sensitive if it turns out that, things were illegal or were not done properly. So there's this real kind of desire to say, sort of from the top down, even when we get a terrible result, even when something happens that we really don't want, we're going to respect the system to the extent that we kind of pretend that it was all totally above board and that it was all okay. And I do wonder, what impact does that have ultimately on the people? And we know that, in the last few weeks, they've been talking about with Brexit and the planning for Brexit, they are anticipating social unrest. They are anticipating, we could have riots in the streets. We could have large scale social unrest. We have a country, and America does too, I think, at the moment, which is really, split down the middle, and the level of kind of anger and rage on both sides, and the kind of inability to find any common ground. And in that campaign we had an MP who was murdered by someone who disagreed with her. I mean, we are in a situation where things are in a very kind of tense and confrontational mode. And we also have a younger generation who, you know, to look more optimistically, maybe we have to hope they're going to change the world. You know, they seem quite switched on. They seem quite kind of, you know, what you were saying about this belief in a shared humanity and kind of moving forward. They seem quite kind of politically engaged. They seem to have good, decent kind of attitudes to things. Maybe they're going to be the ones who are going to sort it all out, you know, not our generation probably. But I mean, who knows? I think that the world is changing, and the kind of interaction between people and the state and their leaders and all these sort of things are shifting. You know, we've seen them shift in the last few years, and I don't know what in 10, 20, 30 years the impact of that could be. It may be that we find that we're living in a very different world to the one that we've grown up in.
Yeah, we do live in a vastly different world. There's no getting around that. I mean, you know, 20 years ago, when I was the age of, you know, the kind of teenagers I work with on a daily basis, it was a completely different world. It was Deep Space Nine was coming to an end, you know, 1999. And everyone was, you know, it was the millennium was about to happen, and you know, it was pre 9/11, at which point a lot of things changed as well in terms of governments and politics, and you know, it was a very different world, and it's easy, and again, that's when the nostalgia comes in. It is easy for people to look back at the time when they were younger and the time when things seemed simpler, you know, and think, oh, that's what we want to get back to. But the reality is things weren't simpler. Things were complicated. There were problems. There were wars. There were systems that didn't work, systems that were breaking down. There were fears among the population. You know, it's people forget. People are very quick to forget history, and they're very quick to forget their own history and the story of their own past. And right now, with, like you say, with the way technology has developed and the way news and truth is confused and is in a state of manipulation without question by people with agendas, it is an uncertain path. Whether it leads to something as cataclysmic as happens in the Star Trek future history is debatable. If I was a betting man, I'd suspect it won't. I suspect that one of the things the Star Trek, you know, writers in future history never quite understood, and you mentioned this earlier, is quite the role of the internet, is quite the role of the online world, is quite the role of how technology and our interface with it. You know, none of these 90s or obviously 60s kind of shows predicted our Black Mirror obsession with the black box in our hand. You know, not really.
Well, or even like to the level of, I mean, on Mission Log, they joke about this. You know, the fact that, say the pad, you could say Star Trek invented the iPad. Okay, so in Next Gen, everyone has these pads everywhere, but it never occurred to them the idea that one pad could have more than one thing on it at a time. Do you know what I mean? So there's like that. The idea, the prediction is there. It's a brilliant idea. Okay, so there's this device. It's very convenient. You can carry it around with you. It's a bit like a book. It's got a flat screen. It's got a touch screen. And I know that there's something similar in 2001, and maybe they took it from there. So it's not necessarily Star Trek that invented it, but you know, they certainly popularized and made it an integral part of their world, insofar as, you know, there's probably a pad in every episode of TNG, DS9, Voyager, kind of for that whole stretch. But somehow they were limited in their imagination to thinking, okay, it's a bit like a book, so each one is a bit like a book. So, you know, in the same way as you might get 3 books off the shelf, you get 3 pads out. And, you know, just something as basic as that where instantly real life technology, you know, once they developed the iPad, and they became very popular very quickly, probably in part because we'd had decades of being primed by Star Trek to think that this was something we were going to have in the future and it was a big deal, almost immediately the real life version outstrips the fictional version. And I think with the internet, it's the same kind of thing. So as much as Star Trek did predict a lot of technology accurately, and inspired a lot of technology, something like the internet, you know, maybe when we were kids, it was almost, and it's hard, I think, for anyone younger than us to understand. I mean, I think we do come from a generation, my partner and I were talking about this, the other day. She was saying, you know, we're the kind of the last analog generation, basically, that we do remember the VHS tapes, and we do remember the kind of, you know, the technology before everything was digitalized. And we do remember a life before, the internet. You know, I remember, I mean, my mum got the internet quite early. I think it was still quite a sort of new thing, and I remember partly because I had an aunt who was working for Microsoft at the time, and an uncle who was working for American Express in kind of you know, computery stuff and was also into kind of cutting edge computing stuff. And so they sort of talked her into getting this thing, the internet. So she got it on her computer and whatever. And we had this modem that made all these awful noises. And so on. But I remember the first time we installed all of this, and it was all incredibly complicated and difficult at the time to get it all going. And then we got this thing up that was like the web browser. And I was like, well, now what? You've got this thing that everyone's talking about. Supposedly the future is this great thing. And I just didn't know what to do with it because and that's the thing with a new technology. You're kind of, a large part of it is, you have to sort of integrate it into your life. But at first it is just this alien thing. And you sort of think, well, what do I use this for? What okay, it's sitting there on the screen now. And I literally don't know what to do with it. I don't know how it's supposed to enhance my life or not. And for someone of a younger generation, that is almost inconceivable to comprehend in some ways, I suppose, because it's so much part of the culture and it's so much part of and everyone has a website, everything has a website, everyone has a kind of online presence, one way or another. But in those days that absolutely wasn't the case. And something like Facebook, when Facebook came along, that was a totally radical concept, or MySpace, I suppose, this idea that you had your own little chunk of the internet, because previously it was companies and corporations who had web pages, and you could go there and maybe read information or find opening times, or it was a bit like a library that you might search. But the idea that everyone could open their own stall and kind of say, this is me, again, completely radical shift that something like Star Trek in that period couldn't possibly have predicted. Something like that, I don't think, and didn't. On the other hand, they did predict an awful lot of things and inspired an awful lot of things. And there are a lot of things today that, something like Alexa on the Amazon Echo, it's no coincidence that one of the wake words they added is computer. So you can literally pretend you're in a Star Trek episode, and, the iPad, the fact they called it a pad. I mean, it is kind of pad shape, but I'm sure that is, that's not coincidental. That is kind of, marketing driven by that kind of Star Trek history. The fact that early flip phones, consciously mirrored the look of the communicators in Star Trek. And there was an interesting thing I saw that they were talking about with Discovery, going back to those flip communicators, that the way that people were using them was different because, the people who were of the generation that actually grew up with flip phones were holding them more like a phone and less like a communicator in Star Trek. And they had to be sort of told, no, in Star Trek, they hold them like, look at the original series. This is how they hold them, from an era when it was just a prop and it didn't do anything and no one had ever used anything like that before. So again, there's that sort of on literally on an unconscious level that technology kind of works its way into your life. And, when it has to become familiar enough that your behavior around it. It's a bit like, if you never smoked a cigarette and you have to smoke a cigarette, in a TV show or in a play or something, you're holding it wrong. You're not doing it naturally. You're not, because your body is not familiar with that kind of routine. And it's the same sort of thing with the new technology. You have this kind of process of getting to know it and getting to learn how does it, how do you kind of merge with that technology in a sense?
I think this is more likely to be the road we go down. I think realistically, I think if I'm honest, I think in its own way, a more realistic depiction of where we might end up in less than 50 years, in maybe 10, 20, 30 years, is the novel Ready Player One. Really, I think, which I believe you're a fan of, Duncan. I'm sure we've talked about this.
I love that novel.
It's a great novel, and I think it could end up being in its own way quite prophetic in that it's very much about how we escape. We escape into these imagined worlds. We escape into, a world in terms of Ready Player One, and this is where it's drawn as much criticism as praise. It's about nostalgia. It is escaping into a world where you can just live in the Starfleet universe. If you want to, you could essentially live in the world of Star Trek, through a visor on your head that taps you into an internet which has gone way beyond the realms of anything you can conceive. And I think while the world around you just collapses into nothingness, really. And I think that could be the sadder trajectory we go on, as opposed to a giant nuclear cataclysm necessarily. I think the social collapse of world order, you talked about the lack of trust in systems and governments, and I think you're more likely to see almost like a this is probably an over-characterized way of saying it, but, a fall of the Roman Empire. I think you're more likely to just see a decline, a general decline.
Just as we get bewitched by these screens, in a sense, by the possibilities of technology. I suppose that's true. Like the Telosians, who become so, bewitched by their mental powers that their society collapses or something.
Yeah.
I guess that is true. And you're right. Yeah, I do like Ready Player One. You could say, of course, that what's depicted in Ready Player One on one level is not a million miles away from what Next Generation predicted with the game, which is kind of the same idea, only there's this kind of drug-like element and this kind of mind control element, and it's much more simplistic. But, if you, commuting on the tube and you look and everyone sitting there is playing Angry Birds on their iPhone or whatever, we're not a million miles away from that kind of, or Pokemon Go. Was it Pokemon Go, the one where the sort of augmented reality version, which people were getting
bizarre.
Totally obsessed with? That was a bit like the game, and also doing quite dangerous things in order to get the right Pokemon or whatever, that sort of interaction between the technology and the real world, where they're sort of one overlaid over the other. But you're right. I mean, in Ready Player One, there's definitely this sense that as the world has kind of, gone to the dogs, the seduction of this kind of nostalgic other world, this sort of alternate reality inside the VR machines becomes more appealing. And then the more time people spend in them, the less they care about the real world and the less significant the real world really seems to be. And there is also, I think, a sense in that novel of a sort of generational divide there as well, where, especially for younger people who've grown up with it, who've grown up with this kind of alternate reality, that is almost as real as the real world. They go to school in the VR world. They kind of live their lives in the VR world. That becomes reality for them. And I suppose that's true. You could just kind of go down that rabbit hole and never really emerge. And, that is kind of a danger. And again, you could say, Star Trek has not so much had virtual reality, but obviously we've had the holodeck and the idea of, these kind of technological, photorealistic technological recreations. And in our world, the closest that we have to that is kind of VR. You can now play the that Bridge Crew Star Trek game. Bridge Crew, exactly. With the VR helmet, and it is a bit like being on a holodeck. I mean, I haven't tried it, but as far as I can see, it is aiming to be a little bit like being on a holodeck. So I suppose there is obviously, we talked about technology in terms of these kind of entertainments and quite frivolous things. There are also developments in technology to try to get us to the kind of Star Trek future that are a bit more serious. I mean, you've got the Tricorder Prize for developing, what is basically a kind of, I suppose, I think is it more focused towards a medical tricorder? I'm not sure.
But, I'm not sure.
Sort of diagnostic, a useful scientific instrument, basically. So aside from the fact that it'd be kind of cool to have something that was called a tricorder, it is actually, developing something for science that will hopefully be useful. You've got the development of hyposprays, which I think basically do essentially exist now. One way or another. You've got something like 3D printing, which is obviously, not a million miles away from the idea of a replicator. The difference being, I suppose, that the replicator, it's a bit unclear what's going in, what's the kind of raw material, whereas a 3D printer has to have this kind of raw material to work with. Even things like, the isolinear chips in TNG, the isolinear chips seemed like extremely advanced. Now we have USB sticks. We have all this kind of technology that you kind of stick in and stick out, that kind of thing, in terms of the kind of daily life thing. But then there are also the big things, warp drive, transporters, tractor beams. I was looking into this. This was the preparation I did do for this episode, was I had a look at this book, Star Trek Technology, which I'd recommend. It's kind of a nice coffee table book, and it kind of goes through some of the Star Trek technology and matches up a little bit with what's been going on in the real world. Apparently it is now possible to move microscopic particles using a kind of tractor beam. The only downside is that the tractor beam superheats them in the process. So if you were to, tractor a ship, you'd basically incinerate it at the same time. But there are people working. Apparently Russia has committed the equivalent of $14 trillion of, rubles, I guess, to attempting to teleport a human being by the year 2035, and there have been experiments in transporting particles, I think. I'm not totally up on that, but this is technology that is it's still kind of science fiction, but at the same time there are people trying to push those boundaries, trying to kind of work towards it. Whether there's a wannabe Zefram Cochrane out there trying to develop warp drive, I don't know, because I think warp drive is probably actually one of the hardest in the whole of Star Trek. It's not necessarily theoretically impossible, but practically speaking, it's completely out of our grasp. But, you know, if someone can work that one out, it really could change everything because, you know, quite apart from the aliens coming and finding us, we would have the opportunity to go outside the solar system. We would have the opportunity to explore. We would have the opportunity to do what Star Trek does, you know, to boldly go, to kind of see what's out there in a way that really, you know, at the moment we don't. I mean, the next big thing maybe in our lifetime, perhaps we can send some people to Mars, but that's, you know, that's a long trip. And, that's kind of about the furthest we're likely to get, isn't it, in terms of humans in space? And that's a real limiting factor if we want to kind of, you know, get to the sort of Star Trek future. The Star Trek future isn't just about development on Earth. It's also about humanity's future in space and whether we have one or not.
Maybe the biggest contradiction in the future history of Star Trek in terms of World War III and the mid-21st century is that even in the middle of this global conflict that was going on, the nuclear bombs, the eugenics, all this kind of thing, there were manned space exploration missions still going on. So this in many ways is going to be if we look at it from a realistic point of view, it is a continuity problem in terms of Star Trek, in that writers haven't necessarily watched the episodes or been talking to each other. But in the Next Generation episode, The Royale, we learn about the Ares 4 mission to Mars, which took place in 2032. And in Voyager's One Small Step, we have the launch of the, I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of this, but the Charybdis in 2037, which was the first mission to leave the Sol system. So even in the midst of this war, even in the midst of society breaking down, you still had nations trying to, you know, go beyond the final frontier. You know, there was still this outward looking, you know, notion. And even if you know, this being written into certain episodes of Star Trek is indicative of continuity errors and the fact, and that's the problem. Nobody has sat down and done a proper timeline of World War III. You know, it is inconsistent. There are different shows from different periods in the Star Trek universe saying different things. It is, in that sense, as I said, it is almost mythical. It is almost all these different possibilities that could be brewed into a proper chronological history. But in a way, I think that makes it more interesting. I think it makes it more evocative because you don't quite see the whole picture, and it allows you to wonder about all the different elements going on in the near future to us, but the, you know, the fairly distant past to the Star Trek, you know, future that we live in when we watch the show. So I think it's really interesting that even amidst all the darkness and all the, you know, humanity coming to the brink of extinction, there may well have still been that hope and that Star Trek idea.
And maybe that's quite important. I mean, you know, I described it earlier as Star Trek's Dark Ages, and there is that sort of element there of where, you know, it's all a bit murky, and aside from it all being awful, it's also a bit murky, and the history of it is slightly lost. I mean, I'm curious, you're obviously quite interested in this period of, you know, Star Trek's kind of imagined past. I said earlier, it's not something I've ever given a huge amount of thought to. I've never really particularly gone there. I suppose aside from Past Tense, which is an episode that or a pair of episodes that I do love, but I see that as a little bit different because that feels much more like our near future rather than this kind of World War III, Eugenics Wars, this kind of fantasy sci-fi future. But I'm kind of curious, you know, we know we're getting lots of new Star Trek series. We know that there's, you know, the potential for these short treks to explore all kinds of different periods and so on. Obviously, Star Trek, especially now that it's getting gritty and bloodier and kind of more, you know, darker in many ways with the move, you know, away from network TV and syndication and all that kind of thing. There could be a decision to set a Star Trek series or a Star Trek short trek or something in the midst of World War III, in the midst of the Eugenics Wars. I can see that one. I can see the kind of marketing behind that one. Is that something that would fascinate you? Or is there a sense that, you know, as people always say, but that's not Star Trek? You know, how far back can you go before you get to the bit where it's pre-Star Trek? It's not really Star Trek. Because I think Enterprise had that kind of dilemma. And in a way, I sort of think Enterprise would have been more interesting if it had been a bit more pre-Star Trek and it hadn't kind of got as far. So, do you know what I mean? If we'd seen that development happening more slowly, whereas actually Broken Bow, it feels like, yeah, it all looks a bit different and it all feels a bit different, but they're, you know, they are actually Starfleet. They're kind of, they've got a bit further forward than maybe we were expecting. But I do think there's that kind of tension and that interesting question, like, if it goes too far back, if it goes too primitive, is that actually quite a different show? And is that really not you know, do we have to then expand the bubble of Star Trek to be not just the kind of utopian future, but the kind of all the stuff that led up to it?
I like what you said earlier about how, in a way, you date the Star Trek universe by first contact. I like that. I think that's really true. I think, you know, Star Trek First Contact is the beginning of the Star Trek story. You know, that first moment between Zefram Cochrane and the Vulcans is the beginning of it all. That's where, in a way, I think exploring after that point would be Star Trek. I think exploring the early developments with the Vulcans, you know, certain space missions going out there, testing warp drive, you know, the reformation of humanity into what leads to the United Earth government and the first inklings of Starfleet and that kind of thing. I think that would be an interesting project, even if it's just a novel, or even if it might work better as a tie-in novel, to be honest, because you could probably do more, skip, you know, time a little bit quicker, or maybe a trilogy, you know, of novels. Whereas I think a series, you would have to be a little bit more contemporary. Don't know if it would work as a series, but I think anything before that, I think actually showing the conflict, I don't know if you need to do that. I think the idea of that and what it is enough, because it ultimately, it's the point that it's the transformative, like you say, modern dark age of humanity's history that allows you to get to the point where you've reached a level of enlightenment. So I don't know if we need to dwell on that as much. I would like to see like you say, the bit before Enterprise, but the bit after First Contact, that little 50 years or so, 70 years, that I think would be interesting.
Well, there you go. Alex Kurtzman, if you're listening, you got a pitch right there.
Of course he's listening.
For what to do next. Of course, yeah.
Of course he's
absolutely.
Listening, you know.
He's a regular.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, Tony, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find you online if they want to get in touch with you, and also a little bit about what you've been up to since we last had you on Primitive Culture?
As usual, I've been everywhere with my fingers in a million pies. I've been writing a book, which will be out later this year, hopefully, or next year, all about TV and things like that, and films. I've been doing bits more podcasting here and there. I've just launched a podcast network called We Made This, which you can find at We Made This Pod on Twitter. If you want to investigate some of the different podcasts we have, including my X-Files podcast, the Xcast, which I think I've mentioned before on the show. And, you know, I'm writing. I've got my website, www.settthetape.com, and you can catch my writings on my Twitter, which is still at AJ Black Writer. So I'm still around. You know, quite a few of you listen to this will know me, and we're connected on social media. But, you know, come and follow me, or come and you know, say hi. I'll be around the Babel conference as well, as always. But yeah, there's plenty going on. But it's been lovely to be back talking Star Trek, and you know, this is a topic I've wanted to do for a while. So it's been a thrill. Thanks, Duncan. That's all right. My pleasure. Always great to have you back. So, you know, but we'll have to keep an eye out there next time you know, if you're coming back in evil Romulan guise, we'll have to be a bit more careful. I'll, you know, let us know next time you want to drop in. Yeah, I'll promise I'm not a member of the Eastern Coalition. Yeah, I'm not. Well, that's something at least. Well, talking about the history of the future and Star Trek's Dark Ages is not the only thing we've been doing this week on Trek FM. So here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed out on elsewhere on the network. Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
And again, the Kelvins, they're enjoyable to me, but I'm so thrilled I don't have to hang, you know, whatever the need was for them in 2006, that's been 13 years ago. I mean, talk about water under the bridge and how much things have changed. The way the world looked, media and Star Trek land looked in 2006, and what the emotion and the vibe and all that was, is completely different now. And these movies are a holdover from that, and that's fine. But our Star Trek world does not depend on them. Earl Grey.
It's nice that she gets some revenge at the end, because they reverse the whole connection to find them, right? But at the same time, that doesn't, like, the ends do not justify the means. Literary Treks.
But Tilly feels she's failed. And I think when you're at that age, failure feels almost like it's going to annihilate you, because you're still quite fragile. Your sense of self is still quite fragile. That if something goes wrong, you think it's the end of the world. And in fact, it's only the secret, of course, being a grown-up is that when things go wrong, you still feel like it's the end of the world, but you kind of pick yourself up a bit more quickly. But Tilly hasn't had those experiences. It's always been success.
The orb.
On top of that, the Ferengi going to the Mirror Universe gives us the opportunity to kind of explore one last time the character of Quark in a way where we are able to see how he's grown.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM, and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter, and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended all right.